3 American soldiers died on a hillside above the Moselle River in October of 1944. Their lieutenant wasn't there. He was half a mile away in the wrong direction. When he came back, a 21-year-old corporal from Baton Rouge walked up and hit him. One punch. Then he stood there and waited for the army to come for him. 20 years at hard labor in Fort Leavenworth. That was what waited for him. 6 weeks later, in a French schoolhouse, the file crossed the desk of a man named George Patton. What Patton did next isn't in any history book, because Patton destroyed the evidence. This is that story, or as close to it as we can get. Nancy, France. Late October, 1944. The rain had not stopped for 11 days. Inside a stone building that had once been a French schoolhouse, a coal stove burned low against the wall. The windows were papered over with maps. On the desk, a single kerosene lamp threw a circle of yellow light across a folder 3 inches thick. The man reading the folder was 59 years old. His name was George Smith Patton, Jr. He wore riding breeches and cavalry boots that were still wet from the morning. His hair was going white at the temples. His pistol, ivory-handled, hung on his hip even at his own desk, even in his own headquarters, even at midnight in a room where the only sound was the scratch of his own breathing and the soft collapse of coals in the stove. He was the commanding general of the United States Third Army, and he was reading a court-martial file. The charge sheet was on top. Article of War, Section 65. Assault upon a superior officer. The accused was a corporal from Louisiana. The victim was a lieutenant from the same platoon. The recommendation of the Judge Advocate General's office was general court-martial. The potential punishment was dishonorable discharge and confinement at hard labor for a period not to exceed 20 years. Patton read the charge sheet once, then he read it again, then he set it aside and began to read what was underneath. Outside the window, the rain kept coming. 250 miles to the east, on the German frontier, the men of the Third Army were dying by the hundred in a battle that no one back home would remember by name. The city of Metz. A ring of forts built by the Germans in the 1870s, held by the Germans again in 1944, and standing in the way of an American army that had been told by Supreme Headquarters to keep moving, and had then been told 3 weeks later that there was no more gasoline. That was the war Patton was fighting in October of 1944. Not the war of the newsreels, not the sweeping breakout across France in August, when his tanks had moved so fast that reporters could not keep up, and the Germans in some sectors had simply run. That war was over. The gasoline had gone north to a British field marshal named Bernard Montgomery for an operation called Market Garden, which had failed. And the tanks of the Third Army had ground to a halt in the mud of Lorraine, in front of a city that had not been taken by storm since Attila the Hun had failed to take it in the year 451. Patton knew that number. He had written it down in his diary. He knew a lot of numbers. He knew that his army in the previous 6 weeks had suffered more than 50,000 casualties. He knew that the rain had made the roads impassable to wheeled vehicles for 8 days out of the last 12. He knew that his own son-in-law, a lieutenant colonel named John Waters, was a prisoner of war in a German camp somewhere near the Polish border, and that no one at Supreme Headquarters wanted to talk to him about it. And he knew, because he had been reading it for the last 40 minutes, that a 21-year-old corporal from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, had struck a superior officer in the face with a closed fist on a night in early October in a forward position on the Moselle River. The corporal was not denying it. That was the first thing that caught Patton's attention. Let me say something before we go any further. The story you are about to hear exists in the way certain stories exist inside armies. It was told after the war by men who had served in the Third Army. It was told in veterans' halls in small towns in Louisiana and Texas and Alabama. It was told in letters, and sometimes in kitchens, and sometimes in the long silences of men who did not want to say too much about the war, but who wanted, for reasons of their own, to say this one thing. There are at least 4 versions of it. In some versions, the corporal's name is Reeves. In some versions, it is something else. In some versions, the lieutenant is from Ohio. In some versions, from Pennsylvania. In some versions, the number of dead men is 2. In some versions, it is 3. What we cannot verify, because the whole point of the story is that the file was destroyed, is whether it happened at all. What we can verify is everything around it. We can verify that George Patton, in the fall of 1944, held what the Army called convening authority. We can verify that this authority gave him the legal power to send a court-martial forward or to make one disappear. We can verify that a general court-martial for assault under Article 65 could, in the middle of a shooting war, produce a sentence of 20 years at hard labor in a federal military prison called Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. And we can verify what had happened to Patton himself 14 months earlier, that made him, of all the American generals in Europe, the one man who could not read a file like that without reading it twice. That story is where we have to go. Because to understand why Patton might have torn up a court-martial file for a soldier who struck an officer, you have to understand what happened on the 3rd of August 1943 in a hospital tent outside a town called Nicosia on the island of Sicily. You have to understand what Patton did that day and what it cost him. But first, come back to the desk. Patton is reading the corporal's statement. It is 4 sentences long. The corporal has not asked for a lawyer. He has not asked for a hearing. He has not asked for mercy. He has written 4 sentences on a single sheet of army paper. The lieutenant left the position during the German probe. 3 men died while he was gone. When the lieutenant came back, I hit him. I would do it again. Patton reads the 4 sentences. Then he reads them again. Somewhere on the eastern side of the city, a battery of American 105 howitzers begins to fire, and the sound rolls across the wet fields and reaches the schoolhouse as a low, distant thump that shakes the water in the glass on the desk. Patton does not look up. He is reading the witness statements now. There are 6 of them from enlisted men in the platoon. 2 sergeants, a corporal, and 3 privates. They describe a night in early October, on a position overlooking a bend in the Moselle River, when a German reconnaissance element, probably no more than a reinforced platoon, tested the American line at approximately 0200 hours. They describe an American platoon holding a defensive position without its lieutenant. They describe a senior non-commissioned officer, a staff sergeant, doing what the doctrine of the United States Army said a staff sergeant should not have to do, which was to direct the response to an armed probe without the officer whose job that was. They describe 3 dead men. They describe the lieutenant returning 45 minutes after the probe began and 20 minutes after it ended, from a direction that was not the direction of the company command post, which was where he had told the staff sergeant he was going. They describe a corporal walking up to the lieutenant when the lieutenant returned. They describe a single punch thrown with the right hand. They describe the corporal standing where he was after the punch and waiting, not running, not making excuses, not raising his hands. Waiting. Patton sets the witness statements down. He looks at the coal stove. He does not move for what may be a full minute, and there is no one in the room to time it. He is thinking about a place called Nicosia. He is thinking about a tent. He is thinking about a young man named Charles Cool from Mishawaka, Indiana, who sat on a stool in a field hospital in Sicily on a hot afternoon in August of 1943, and who told a general officer that he could not take it anymore. He is thinking about what he did next. He is thinking about the 11 months that followed. And then he does something that will not appear in any official record of the United States Army. He picks up the file. He weighs it in his hands. He looks at the 4 sentences the corporal wrote. And he thinks about the number 3. 3 men, dead on a hillside above the Moselle in the rain in October on a position that had been left without its officer. He thinks about the mothers of those 3 men. He thinks about the letters that have already been written, in the standard army form, telling those mothers that their sons died bravely in the service of their country, without mentioning that at the moment of their deaths, their officer was more than half a mile away in the wrong direction. He thinks about a corporal, 21 years old, from a city on the Mississippi River, who had grown up with one of the dead men and had enlisted in the same week and had shared a foxhole with him 3 separate nights in Normandy, and who, when he found out what had happened, had walked up to the officer responsible and thrown a single punch and then stood there and waited for whatever the army was going to do to him. He thinks about the article of war. He thinks about the 20 years at Fort Leavenworth. He thinks about the phrase, "I would do it again." He gets up from the desk. He walks to the coal stove. He opens the small iron door on the front of it, and the light from inside washes across his face. He looks like a man who is about to make a decision. Here is what you have to understand about that decision. In the American Army of 1944, a general officer with convening authority could dispose of a court-martial in one of several ways. He could send it forward, he could reduce the charges, he could refer it back for further investigation, he could dismiss it. All of those were legal, all of those left a paper trail. What Patton was about to do was to make the paper trail cease to exist. There is a phrase for this in the language of soldiers. They call it command discretion. It is not written down anywhere in the Articles of War, because the Articles of War are what you are supposed to follow, and command discretion is what you use when you have decided that following them will produce an outcome you cannot live with. Every commanding general in the history of the United States Army has used it at one time or another. Most of them have not talked about it. He was not going to use it because he liked the corporal. He was not going to use it because he hated the lieutenant. He was going to use it because he had read the file, all of it, past the charge sheet and past the JAG recommendation, and into the witness statements and the battalion surgeon's report and the notation at the bottom of the investigative section. The one that was not part of the formal charge, that referenced 2 prior complaints from non-commissioned officers in the platoon about the lieutenant's conduct under fire, complaints that had not been formally acted on, but were now in writing in the file. He had read it, and what he had read had told him that the formal machinery of the United States Army was about to prosecute a corporal for throwing a punch, and was not going to prosecute a lieutenant for leaving his men to die. He closed the door of the stove, he walked back to the desk, he sat down, he picked up the file. I would do it again. He set the file down, he put both hands on it, and in a schoolhouse in Nancy, France, on a night in October of 1944, with a war going on 250 miles to the east, and 3 men lying in the mud of Lorraine and a corporal from Baton Rouge waiting somewhere for the army to tell him what came next. George Patton tore the file in half. The pieces went into the stove door closed. And to understand what he had just done and why he had done it, we have to go back to Sicily. Sicily. The 3rd of August 1943. The heat that summer was the kind of heat that men who fought there would remember for the rest of their lives. It came off the stone of the hillsides in waves. It came out of the ground. It made the metal of a rifle barrel too hot to touch by 10 in the morning. It made the canvas of a field hospital tent smell of dust and iodine and sweat, and the particular sour smell of men who had been sick for a long time in a place where there was not enough water to wash. The tent stood in an olive grove near a town called Nicosia in the middle of the island. The sign at the entrance said 15th Evacuation Hospital. Inside, on a wooden stool in the middle of the ward, a private first class from Indiana sat with his shoulders sloped and his hands folded between his knees. His name was Charles Herman Cool. He was 28 years old. He had grown up in a town called Mishawaka in northern Indiana, where his father had worked in a factory that made cars, and where he himself before the war had worked as a carpet layer. He had been drafted in the spring of 1942. He was assigned to Company L, 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division. The Big Red One, men who had fought at Kasserine Pass in February, at El Geta in March, and who had come ashore at Gela on the southern coast of Sicily on the 10th of July. Cool had been at all of it. On the medical chart clipped to the end of his bed, a doctor had written the words psychoneurosis anxiety state, moderately severe. Under temperature, the doctor had written 102.2 degrees Fahrenheit. What the chart did not say, because no one had run the tests yet, was that Charles Cool had chronic dysentery and malaria, and a fever that was going to get worse before it got better. He sat on the stool with his shoulders sloped and his hands folded, and he waited, and he did not know that the door of the tent was about to open, and he did not know who was about to walk through it. The sound came first. Boots on gravel, 3 sets of them. The canvas flap of the tent lifted. The light of Sicily in August, which is not light so much as a kind of hammering white, came in through the gap and washed out everything in the ward for a moment before the flap dropped again, and the shape of the man who had come in resolved itself against the interior of the tent. He was 57 years old. He wore a helmet polished to a mirror shine and jodhpurs and cavalry boots, and on his hip a single-action Colt revolver he had bought in 1916 and had fitted with an ivory grip back when he had chased a Mexican bandit named Pancho Villa across the Chihuahua Desert. He carried a pair of leather gloves in his left hand. He was Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr. He was the commanding general of the United States 7th Army. He had come to visit the wounded. That was what he did. He did it often. He believed that a commanding general owed it to his men to see them when they were hurt. He would walk from bed to bed. He would kneel down. He would say something that a private from Oklahoma or a corporal from New Jersey could take back to his family. He would pin decorations on chests. He would sometimes weep, and men who saw him weep did not forget it. That was one part of George Patton. The other part of George Patton was about to walk down the ward and stop in front of a stool where a private first class from Indiana sat with his shoulders sloped and his hands folded, and ask him what he was doing there. Cool looked up. The general was standing in front of him. He asked Cool a question. Cool answered it. He said, "I guess I can't take it." That was all he said. He was not at that moment thinking about the malaria that had been building in his blood for 2 weeks. He was not thinking about the dysentery that had left him unable to keep down solid food since the landing at Gela. He was thinking about the shelling and the sound of the shelling, and the fact that when the shelling started, he could no longer stop his hands from shaking. He said, "I guess I can't take it," and the general hit him, open hand, backhand. The leather gloves in the general's left hand folded together, whipping across the side of Cool's face. The stool did not go over. Cool did not fall. He rocked, and he brought his hand up to his cheek, and he did not say anything because there was nothing to say. The general grabbed him by the collar. The general dragged him off the stool. The general shouted words that the nurses standing at the end of the ward would remember, some of them, for the rest of their lives. "Coward, yellow-bellied, get up! Get out of my hospital! Go back to the front!" He dragged Cool to the entrance of the tent. He kicked him. The canvas flap lifted. Cool stumbled out into the white hammering light of the Sicilian afternoon, and behind him, still inside the tent, the general turned on the doctor in charge of the ward and shouted at him not to admit men like that, and the doctor stood at attention and said nothing. The general left. The flap fell. And Charles Cool, 28 years old, from Mishawaka, Indiana, sat down on the gravel outside the tent and put his head in his hands, and did not know that he had a temperature of 102.2, and did not know that he had malaria, and did not know that he had chronic dysentery. He only knew that his face hurt, and that a general had called him a coward. 7 days later, 100 miles to the east, in a hospital tent at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital near the town of Sant'Agata, the same thing happened again. The soldier that time was named Paul G. Bennett. He was 21 years old. He was from South Carolina. He was an artilleryman. His battery had been in continuous action for weeks. His best friend had been wounded 3 nights earlier, and Bennett, who had held the man's hand in the aid station while the man went into shock, had not been the same since. He was sitting on the edge of a cot when Patton came through. Patton asked him what was wrong. Bennett said the word nerves. Patton hit him. Then he pulled the ivory-handled Colt out of the holster on his hip and waved it in Bennett's face, and shouted that men like Bennett ought to be lined up against a wall and shot, and then he hit him a second time, hard enough that the helmet came off Bennett's head and rolled across the tent floor and stopped against the leg of another man's cot. The other man watched it stop. He did not move. Patton left the tent. Bennett sat on the edge of the cot with his hand against the side of his face, and did not say anything, and did not cry, and did not, for what a nurse would later say was the better part of an hour, look up at anyone. You would think that a lieutenant general of the United States Army who had struck 2 enlisted men in field hospitals, in front of dozens of witnesses, in the middle of a shooting war, would have had the story on the front page of every newspaper in America within a week. He did not. The chief surgeon of the 15th Evacuation Hospital, a colonel named Richard T. Arnest, wrote up a report of the Cool incident. He gave it to his commanding officer. That officer gave it to a brigadier general named Frederick Bless, who was the chief surgeon at Allied Force Headquarters in Algiers. Bless read it, he sat with it, and he forwarded it to a 4-star general named Dwight David Eisenhower. Eisenhower was 52 years old. He was the supreme Allied commander in the Mediterranean. He had gone to West Point with George Patton. He had known him for 30 years. He knew better than any man alive what George Patton was capable of in both directions. He read Arnest's report. He read a second report a few days later about the Bennett incident, and on the 17th of August 1943 he sat down in his office in Algiers and wrote George Patton a letter. The letter was not an official reprimand. Eisenhower knew what an official reprimand would do. It would go into Patton's permanent file. It would end his career. It would remove from the Allied order of battle the one commander who, in Eisenhower's private judgment, could win a war of movement against the Germans on the ground of Western Europe. So he wrote something else. He wrote what a man writes to another man he has known for 30 years, when he is furious with him and disappointed in him and cannot afford to lose him. He wrote that he did not doubt Patton's motives. He wrote that he could not condone his conduct. He wrote that Patton was to apologize to the two soldiers, to the medical personnel who had witnessed the incidents, and in front of a full formation to every division of the 7th Army. Every division, in person, standing at a microphone in front of the men. That was Eisenhower's punishment. It was not technically a punishment at all. There would be no formal record of it. There would only be for George Patton the sound of his own voice coming through a loudspeaker in front of formation after formation of American soldiers, division by division, apologizing. Now here is where the story gets strange. Because 60 American and British war correspondents were in Sicily at that time. 60, and every single one of them, within days of the Bennett incident, knew about the slappings. They knew the names. They knew the dates. They knew the hospital tents. And not one of them wrote a word. There is a moment in the history of American journalism that does not get talked about very much. A meeting in Algiers in late August of 1943 between Dwight Eisenhower and a small group of American correspondents, led by Demery Bess of the Saturday Evening Post and Quentin Reynolds of Collier's Weekly. They had come to Eisenhower with the story, and Bess said something to Eisenhower that a modern reporter would not say. He said, "We are Americans first and correspondents second." The correspondents in that room made a decision, and the rest of the press corps in the theater followed their lead. American and British, 60 men in all, sitting on a story that would have won any one of them a Pulitzer Prize. They sat on it because they thought the war effort mattered more. For 3 months no one wrote a word. And then, on the night of Sunday, the 21st of November 1943, at 7 o'clock Eastern Time, on the Blue Network, a syndicated columnist named Drew Pearson opened his weekly 15-minute radio program with a story that he had gotten. No one is exactly sure how. Pearson said that Lieutenant General George Patton had struck an enlisted soldier in a hospital tent. He said that Patton had been severely reprimanded by General Eisenhower. He said, in the last sentence of the story, that he did not expect Patton to be used again in an important combat command. And the war effort, the thing that the 60 correspondents in Algiers had chosen to protect, broke open like a piece of dropped china across the floor of the American public conversation. Half the country was outraged at Patton. Half the country was outraged at Eisenhower for not backing him. Members of Congress made speeches. Editorials were written. Letters poured into the War Department and into Eisenhower's headquarters and into the White House. Patton read them. He sat in Palermo, in a villa that had once belonged to a Sicilian nobleman, and he read letters from mothers in Ohio and fathers in Kansas and wives in Alabama, and he wrote in his diary that he did not understand what was happening to him, and that he had done what he did because he believed it was right and that he was being destroyed for it. Eisenhower could have sent him home. In November of 1943, with public opinion running the way it was running, no one at the War Department would have blamed him. He did not send him home. He kept him in Europe. He kept him without a command. He kept him in a kind of internal exile that lasted from the day of the second slapping to the day he was given back a combat command, almost 11 months. 11 months, during which the war went on without him, during which the Italian campaign ground forward through the mud and the mountains, during which men he had trained were killed at Salerno, at Anzio, at Cassino, during which a plan was being made in England for the invasion of France, and George Patton was not part of it. during which he sat in a villa in Palermo, and then in a hotel in Cairo, and then in a country house in England, and he wrote letters to his wife, and he wrote in his diary, and he waited. He waited to be forgiven, and he thought in those 11 months about a boy on a stool in a hospital tent in Sicily, about the sound his own hand had made, about what he had been trying to accomplish when he did it, about whether he had accomplished any of it. Now hold that, because Eisenhower was about to do something with Patton that would change the war. Eisenhower needed a decoy. The plan for the invasion of France depended on a lie. The lie was that the invasion was going to land at the Pas de Calais, which was the shortest distance across the English Channel, and where any reasonable planner in the German High Command was going to expect it to land. The actual invasion was going to land at Normandy. For the lie to work, it needed a general the Germans would take seriously. The Germans had one such American general on their list. His name was George Patton. And so Eisenhower, who 14 months earlier had put George Patton in an internal exile that had come close to breaking him, now used the exile itself. He announced, through channels that he knew the Germans were monitoring, that Patton had been given command of a new army group in the south of England, called the 1st United States Army Group, and that this army group was preparing to invade the Pas de Calais. There was no such army group. There were only inflatable tanks made of rubber, arrayed in fields in Kent, so that German reconnaissance planes could photograph them. There were only radio operators broadcasting fake unit traffic on frequencies that German intercept stations were listening to. And there was George Patton, wearing his 4 stars and his ivory-handled Colt, driving around Kent in a jeep, giving speeches to units that did not exist, being photographed at points along the coast where the Germans could see him. He was the largest single decoy of the Second World War. It worked. On the 6th of June 1944, when the real invasion landed in Normandy, Adolf Hitler, in his headquarters in East Prussia, refused for a full week to release the 15 German divisions he was holding in reserve at the Pas de Calais. He refused because he thought Normandy was a diversion. He thought the real invasion, the one commanded by George Patton, was still coming. It was not. But because he believed it was, the 15 divisions that could have driven the Allies back into the sea in the first 2 weeks of the Normandy campaign sat in their barracks at Calais and waited for an invasion that never came and the beachhead in Normandy held. Patton, in effect, won a battle he was never in by being a decoy, by being the thing that Eisenhower had made of him, out of the wreckage of what he had done in that tent in Sicily. Now sit with what Eisenhower did, because it matters for what came later. Eisenhower had, in his hands, in August of 1943, a report on the conduct of a lieutenant general who had struck 2 enlisted men in field hospitals. Under the Articles of War, that conduct was a court-martial offense. He could have processed it formally. He did not. He read past the charge. He read into the situation. He read Patton, whom he had known for 30 years, and he made a judgment that the formal machinery of military justice in that case was going to produce an outcome he could not live with. So he wrote the letter. He ordered the apology. He filed the report in a place where it would not come out until Drew Pearson pried it out 3 months later. That is command discretion. That is a commanding general reading past the charge sheet. That is Dwight Eisenhower doing to George Patton in 1943 what George Patton 14 months later in a schoolhouse in Nancy would do to a corporal from Baton Rouge. But we are not done yet, because there was another court-martial file that summer of 1943 in Sicily, not Patton's. Not directly. It was the file on 2 American soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division who were charged with the premeditated murder of a group of Italian prisoners of war on the road outside a town called Biscari on the 14th of July, 1943, 4 days after the invasion. The number of Italian prisoners killed by American troops in the area around Biscari in the days after the landings was 73. The formal court-martial was brought by Lieutenant General Omar Bradley. The defense that the 2 soldiers offered at the court-martial was that they had been following orders. Specifically, they said they had been following the orders that General George Patton had given on the 27th of June, 1943, in a speech to the 45th Division just before it embarked for Sicily. In that speech, according to multiple witnesses who were prepared to testify, Patton had told the men that when the enemy resisted and continued to fire on them from within 200 yards, they were to kill him. He had said, according to at least one officer who was there, that they were not to be troubled about taking prisoners. The defense was going to call those witnesses. The defense was going to put George Patton, in effect, on trial. Bradley read the file. Bradley knew what the defense witnesses were prepared to say. He steered the investigation away from Patton. The two soldiers were tried. One was convicted, one was acquitted, and the witnesses who would have named Patton on the stand were never called. The dead Italian prisoners went into a shallow grave in Sicily and never came out of it in any American historical accounting that reached the public until decades after the war. And George Patton, who had already survived one scandal that summer, survived a second one that most people never even heard about. He knew about it. He knew what Bradley had done for him. He wrote about it in a way that was elliptical and did not name the incident directly in his diary. He knew that a file had been destroyed to protect him. He knew what that felt like. He knew what it looked like from the inside. And now, in the fall of 1944, in a schoolhouse in Nancy, France, with the rain on the windows and the coal stove burning low and the pieces of a court-martial file already curling black in the fire, George Patton knew what it looked like from the other side, too. He had been the man in the tent. He had been the man who had struck an enlisted soldier and had been protected from the consequences. He had been the man who had been protected again when a different file had come across a different desk and been made to disappear. He had walked, in those 11 months in exile, through the shape of what an army does when the formal law would destroy a man it needs, and what an army does when the formal law would let a man walk who ought not to. He had seen it from both sides. He had been the beneficiary. He had watched Eisenhower do it. He had watched Bradley do it. Because George Patton, in the year 1944, was no longer the man who had walked into a hospital tent in Nicosia. He was still angry. He was still profane. He was still the man who wore ivory-handled pistols and quoted the Iliad and believed he had been a Roman legionnaire in a previous life. But he had been through the fire. And when a file came across his desk in a schoolhouse in Nancy on a night in October of 1944, with 4 sentences written by a 21-year-old corporal from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, he read all of it. He read past the charge sheet. He read into the witness statements, and into the battalion surgeon's report, and into the notation at the bottom of the investigative section that referenced 2 prior complaints about the lieutenant's conduct under fire. He read the 4 sentences again. He read the last one twice. I would do it again. And in the yellow light of the kerosene lamp, in a room that had once been a French schoolhouse, George Patton did what Dwight Eisenhower had done for him. He read past the charge, and he made a decision. 7 weeks later, on the 16th of December 1944, the Germans came out of the Ardennes forest with 200,000 men and 1,000 tanks. They came where no one thought they would come. The line broke. Whole American regiments were surrounded and captured. A convoy of American prisoners was machine-gunned in a snowy field outside a Belgian village called Malmedy, and the number of dead in the field was 84. And at a crossroads in the middle of the Ardennes, in a town called Bastogne, the men of the 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division were dug in with not enough ammunition, and not enough winter clothing, and not enough of anything, and they were surrounded. The Germans had asked them to surrender. The American commander in Bastogne, a brigadier general named Anthony McAuliffe, had answered with a single word. He said, "Nuts!" 3 days into the crisis, on the morning of the 19th of December, in a stone building in Verdun, France, Eisenhower called his commanders to a meeting. He was 54 years old. He had aged in the 6 months since the invasion in a way that the photographs from that one winter showed if you knew what to look for. At the table with him were his 2 American Army Group commanders, Omar Bradley and Jacob Devers, and seated to Eisenhower's right, his British deputy, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder. They were waiting for one man. That man arrived at 11:15. He came through the door in his cavalry boots and his ivory-handled pistol and a long overcoat that was wet at the shoulders from the drive up from Nancy. He did not salute. He walked to the map at the head of the room. He looked at it for perhaps 5 seconds. And he sat down. He did not look worried. That was what the other officers in the room would remember later. They would remember that George Patton, at the moment when the entire American position in Europe was in the greatest danger it had been in since the invasion, looked like a man who had been waiting for exactly this. 'Cause he had. Eisenhower opened the meeting. He turned to the map. He indicated the German penetration into the Ardennes, which by that morning was 70 miles wide and 40 miles deep. He said to George Patton one question. He said, "When can you attack?" Patton did not consult with his staff. He did not look at the map again. He did not ask for time to think about it. He said, "The morning of the 22nd, with 3 divisions." There was a pause in the room. The pause was the sound of professional soldiers, some of the best in the world, doing the arithmetic in their heads, and not being able to make it come out to anything that resembled what George Patton had just said. 3 divisions, 100 miles, 90 degrees, 48 hours, in the coldest winter in Belgium in 40 years, on roads that were sheets of ice. It could not be done. Every man in that room, except one, believed it could not be done. Eisenhower looked at him for a long moment, and he said, "Every time I get a new star, I get attacked." Patton, who had received his 4th star 4 months earlier, said, "Every time I get attacked, I get a new star." What is not on the record is what Eisenhower thought, in the 5 or 6 seconds after Patton spoke, sitting there in Verdun with the map behind him, and the American army bleeding in the snow 150 miles to the north. He thought about a hospital tent in Sicily. He thought about a letter he had written 17 months earlier. He thought about 11 months of exile and about a decoy operation in the fields of Kent. He believed him. The order went out. What happened next was not a miracle. It was arithmetic and telephone lines, and men who had not slept in 3 days, and staff officers who had, in fact, been planning the movement since the 17th of December, 48 hours before Eisenhower asked for it, because George Patton had told them on the night of the 17th to be ready. He had done it on his own authority. He had done it without permission. He had done it because he had looked at the map on the 17th of December and had seen what Bradley had not yet seen, and had told his staff, in his headquarters in Nancy, that they were going to be asked to move north within 72 hours, and that when they were asked he was going to say yes. He had 3 separate plans by the morning of the 19th. That is the thing that gets lost in the way the story is told. The 48 hours was not a boast. It was a fact. It was a fact that George Patton had made into a fact by refusing 3 days earlier to wait for anyone to tell him what he already knew. He read past the charge, again, this time on a map. The 3 divisions he had promised Eisenhower, the 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry Division, began to move. They moved through the night. They moved on roads that were solid ice under the tires. They moved with headlights taped down to a slit the width of a thumbnail. And commanding the lead battalion of 4th Armored Division was a 30-year-old lieutenant colonel named Creighton Abrams from Springfield, Massachusetts, who would live to become the Army Chief of Staff 25 years later. On the 26th of December 1944, at 10 minutes to 5 in the afternoon, a Sherman tank from his battalion called Cobra King rolled through the German ring and into the American lines outside Bastogne. And the siege would end. 6 days after the meeting in Verdun. 4 days after the 48 hours had already expired. But end it did. Now come back with me. Come back to a town that most Americans have never heard of, in a country that most Americans could not find on a map without help. The town is called Ham. It is in Luxembourg. It sits on a hill above a river, and on that hill, on land given to the United States by the government of Luxembourg after the war, there is a cemetery. The cemetery is 50 acres. There are 5,076 American soldiers buried in it. Most of them died in the Battle of the Bulge. Most of them are 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. Their headstones are made of white marble. They are laid out in 9 plots that curve in long, gentle arcs across the grass. There are trees planted between the plots. There is a chapel at one end and a pool of water in front of the chapel. And at the front of the cemetery, standing by itself, is a headstone that is exactly the same shape and size as all the others. The name on the headstone is Patton. He is buried there because he asked to be. He asked in the will he drew up in 1945 to be buried with the men of the Third Army who had died in the Bulge. He asked to be given no special monument. He asked to be marked with the same white marble cross that a private first class from Beaumont, Texas, or a corporal from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, would be marked with. He got what he asked for. He is there. He died on the 21st of December, 1945, not in combat. He had gone hunting on the 9th of December in a Cadillac staff car on a country road outside Mannheim, Germany. Another vehicle, a 2.5-ton truck, had turned in front of him at low speed. The Cadillac struck the truck. The other men in the car were unhurt. Patton was thrown forward and struck the metal frame of the partition behind the driver's seat with his forehead and his neck. He broke his neck. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He lived for 12 days in a hospital in Heidelberg, unable to move his arms or his legs, breathing with difficulty, speaking with difficulty, holding on to the last thing he had by an act of will that the doctors who treated him said they had never seen before in a patient with his kind of injury. On the 11th day, in the afternoon, he asked his wife Beatrice, who had flown over from Massachusetts to be with him, to read to him. She read to him from the Bible. She read for a long time. And on the evening of the 21st of December, 1945, at 5 minutes to 6 in the evening, in a hospital bed in Heidelberg, Germany, George Smith Patton, Jr., 60 years old, closed his eyes for the last time and did not open them again. He was buried on the 24th, Christmas Eve, in the rain, at Ham. Now come back to Nancy, come back to the schoolhouse. Come back to the coal stove and the yellow lamplight and the papered windows and the 3-inch file that is not on the desk anymore. The pieces of it are in the stove. The corporal from Baton Rouge, in the version of the story that we have, went back to his unit. He did not know what had happened to his file. He was told by a company clerk that the matter had been resolved. He did not ask what that meant. He was 21 years old. He had grown up on the west bank of the Mississippi River in a town where his father worked in a chemical plant. He had enlisted because his best friend had enlisted. His best friend was dead now in a shallow grave near a bend in the Moselle River in eastern France, along with 2 other men from the platoon, and no court-martial was going to be brought against a corporal who had thrown one punch to say that this was not going to happen without being marked. The corporal served out the war. He was there in the last week of December, in the mud of Luxembourg, in a truck that was part of the Third Army's drive north to Bastogne. He came home in the fall of 1945. He went back to Baton Rouge. He got a job. He married. He had children. He raised them. He talked sometimes in the way that men of that generation talked, which was to say almost never, about the war. He did not know until the day he died who had made the file disappear. He suspected, but he did not know. Nobody had ever told him. There is a question here that we have to sit with. Because George Patton, in the version of the story we have told, tore up a court-martial file. He did it on his own authority. He did it in a room where no one was watching. Some of you, listening to this, are going to think he was right. Some of you are going to think he was wrong. The men who think Patton was wrong say this. They say that the whole point of the Uniform Code of Military Justice is that no one is above it. That a general who tears up a court-martial file is a general who has decided that his judgment is worth more than the process. That the process exists precisely to prevent that. That the whole reason you have military law is so that a young corporal in a schoolhouse basement in Louisiana in 1944 does not depend, for whether he goes to Fort Leavenworth or goes home, on whether the general officer who signs his file happens to have a good heart on a particular Tuesday. They say that a general officer with a good heart is not a system of justice. They are not wrong. The men who think Patton was right say this. They say that when the machinery of justice, running by its own logic, is about to prosecute a corporal for the moral offence of having a conscience, while failing to prosecute a lieutenant for the actual offence of having caused men to die, then the machinery is broken. That the whole reason you have a commanding officer with convening authority is precisely for the moment when the machinery is about to produce an outcome that no soldier in the unit, no member of the enlisted ranks, no honest officer up or down the chain of command would be able to look at and say, that is right. They say that Patton did not act on impulse. They say that he read the file. They are also not wrong. I do not know how to resolve that. I do not think it is my job to resolve it. It is one of the questions that the American Army has been sitting with, in one form or another, since the day George Washington took command of the Continental Army outside Boston in July of 1775. But I know this. I know that George Patton on that night in Nancy did not tear up the file because he liked the corporal. He tore it up because he read it. He read all of it. That story, the one about the corporal and the lieutenant and the file that went into the stove, I have told you already, and I owe it to you to say it again, is a story that lives in the memory of the Third Army in a way that we cannot verify from the documentary record. The record is what he burned. We do not know if the corporal's name was Reeves. We do not know if the lieutenant's name was Weber. We do not know if the night on the Moselle was a night on some other river 100 miles from there. We know the shape of the story. We know that men who served in the Third Army under George Patton told versions of it in kitchens and veterans' halls for the rest of their lives. We know why they told it. They told it because the man they had served under was a man who had been on both sides of that kind of file. He had been the man who had struck a soldier, and he had been protected. He had been the man who had ordered a speech before Sicily that had ended in 73 dead prisoners, and he had been protected. He knew what Eisenhower had done for him. He knew what Bradley had done for him. He knew what he owed, though he never said the word. And when a file came across his desk that showed him the machinery of the army preparing to grind down a corporal for having done a thing that any honest man in the platoon would have understood, he did what had been done for him. He read past the charge. I want you to picture him one more time, 60 years old, ivory-handled pistol on his hip, cavalry boots wet from the rain, sitting in a circle of yellow lamplight in a French schoolhouse in the fall of 1944. The war is not over. He does not know that he will die in a hospital bed in Heidelberg 13 months from now. He does not know that Bastogne will be surrounded in 7 weeks, and that he will be asked to drive his army through the snow to save it. He does not know that he will stand on the 4th of April 1945 at the gates of a Nazi labor camp called Ohrdruf and see for the first time what the war he has been fighting was actually about, and that he will step into the courtyard and see the bodies stacked against the fence and turn away and vomit onto the ground, and that he will then order every German civilian from the surrounding town to walk through the camp and see it, because he has decided in that moment that some things cannot be allowed to be forgotten. He does not know any of that yet. He only knows what he is holding in his hands, a 3-inch file. Charge sheet, a 4-sentence statement from a corporal who has not asked for mercy. He weighs it, he looks at the stove. And in a room where no one is watching him, in a war that will not remember what he did that night, because he made sure it would not remember, George Patton tears the file in half and puts it in the coal stove and closes the door. The flames take it, the paper curls. The names on it, if they were ever names, become smoke and go up the chimney into the wet October air of Lorraine. Somewhere in the dark, 150 miles to the east, the men of the Third Army are asleep in their foxholes, and some of them will not wake up in the morning, and some of them will, and some of them will live to see their grandchildren. And a corporal from Baton Rouge, in a bunk in a replacement depot somewhere behind the lines, is lying awake with his eyes on the ceiling, waiting for the army to come for him. The army is not going to come. He will not know why. He will spend the rest of his life not knowing. And that in the end is the whole story. Not the punch, not the lieutenant, not the file. The story is that a man who had been forgiven when forgiveness was more than he deserved learned to read past the charge sheet. He learned it in a tent in Sicily. He learned it in 11 months of exile. He learned it from a letter Eisenhower wrote him in August of 1943. And he spent the rest of the war passing it forward, one file at a time, into a coal stove in a French schoolhouse where no one was watching. The stove is not there anymore. The schoolhouse is not there anymore. The corporal is not there anymore. George Patton is not there anymore. But the story is. And the question the story asks, the question about what a man with authority does when the law and the truth are pointing in different directions, that question is still there too. He read the file. He made his choice. You will make yours. If you have made it this far, thank you for staying with the story. If there are more stories from the Second World War you want us to tell us in the comments below. And subscribe. There are more files. There are always more files.